Oh, you know what time it is. It's time to get back into the big worms that become small walkers. With the events of Perfection Valley well known at this point, the world has accepted that there was an undiscovered species of worms that could and would eat man if they tread into their territory. While still not a widespread concern for many people, certain areas of the planet were still highly accessible for this cluster of species and their subsequent descendants. In Tremors 2 Aftershock, however, there is a twist that was unforeseen. The worms would have an unseen adaptation that makes them even more dangerous than those that were under the ground. Even getting high up into a tower would ultimately prove fruitless to save you due to the problem-solving abilities that they contained. So in today's episode, we will discuss how those creatures came about, why they are adapted the way they are, and where might these adaptations have come from. But before moving ahead, obligatory 4th channel plug, I'm narrating stories over at Roanoke Tales, and we'll be adding SCP readings in the future. Let me know what you think about it. If you do decide to check it out, I'm still learning, still adapting to the reading style, and I do read the comments and make adjustments. All right, let's get to it. So as usual, you guys know what I'm going to say, but for all you new guys and gals out there, basically there will be a timestamp up on screen. If you want to bypass the video to that point because either you don't want to see the summary or haven't seen the movie, well, you haven't seen the movie, I mean, that's probably an issue because there's obvious spoilers here. Then again, the movie's been out for like 25 years almost, so quarter of a century seems like enough time. Regardless, head there and we will get to the breakdown of these creatures and discuss their adaptations. For everyone else, let's go over why walking is scarier than crawling in today's episode. We open up our story in Mexico. Apparently working on a pipeline, it would appear that this particular person's co-workers have been swallowed up by some unseen monster. Unfamiliar to him, but a familiar sight to us, he crawls across a pipeline with a Graboid slowly moving under the ground, tracking him. As he reaches the end, and the creature appears to begin its main attack, he jumps across 55-gallon drums, which is actually pretty smart. Keeping it random and precise, he's attempting to make it to a truck in the distance. However, the Graboid can hear this and eventually catches up to him and then knocks him to the ground. I swear, if he would have just stayed still, this thing probably would have not known any difference between him and the 55-gallon drums. However, through his thrashing, it finds him and then eats him. We jump back over to America where Earl is attempting to wrangle a couple of ostriches. Which, here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that the largest single cell in the world is an ostrich egg? Moving past the creepy birds with man legs, a car approaches with a man named Grady and Senor Ortega. They are approaching Earl because of his experience and what they have heard about him. Being a world-renowned Graboid hunter, Senor Ortega wants to recruit him to stop the creatures from consuming his men. Down in Mexico, they are having issues with a large group of Graboids numbering to about 20. After Earl hears this, he basically tells them there's no way he's going to meet his end for that and then heads inside. Senor Ortega continues to inquire about Val from the first movie, but we all know Kevin Bacon isn't going to show up for Tremors 2, The Quest for More Money. Speaking of money, Grady then says that he will talk to Earl and see if he can't convince him. He informs Earl that they are willing to pay $50,000 per Graboid taken out, and not only that, the military will provide them with everything they need to take out these creatures. Earl contemplates this and says no. After a brief discussion, though, about how Earl wasn't getting paid for anything and he should have gotten a lawyer after the first Graboid incident, he's convinced that this is his second chance at making some great fortune and reluctantly agrees to go to Mexico to take these things out. Grady says that he will go with him, wanting to see these things up close and personal, and then they begin their trek. Arriving down at the processing plant, there is only a skeleton crew of people left. Everyone else has been sent home and work has ceased after about 6 workers were reportedly eaten by these creatures. The crew remaining there are Senor Ortega, Kate Riley, her assistant, and Pedro. Grady and Earl are tasked with luring these creatures in, but are briefed on the general area and where their movement has been most active. After getting all the information, munitions, and seismographs they need, they head out the next morning into the open hillside to lure these things in and use high energy release methods to blow apart the Graboids. The old saying of don't fix what ain't broke applies here. However, this time they have new methods. Utilizing a remote controlled truck, they are able to lure these things in and help them meet their demise quite easily. Eventually, however, Grady gets too comfortable, believing that these things are just big dumb animals. He gets on the ground to go after an umbrella. As he does this, one approaches from stealing the radio earlier and then begins attacking the truck as he gets back into it. Unfortunately, their method of dragging chains from earlier to make noises has also inadvertently caused them to get snagged by a Graboid. It begins dragging the truck until they are lucky enough to have the chain snap as the creature tries to drag them under a rock. The truck seems to be alright, but as they check the seismograph monitor, they have attracted about 8 more Graboids. They decide that that's enough hunting for today and bob and weave out of the area. Earl at this point realizes that they are going to need some help. Earl gets on the radio when they get back and calls in the man, the myth, the legend, Burt Gummer. Burt has run into hard times with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and without the threat of total nuclear nuclear war, his wife says that he's become too stressed and she leaves to go stay with her mother. I mean, but also, who could really expect Reba to also come back for Tremors 2? Not likely. Regardless, Bert doesn't have much going on currently, so he says that he would be happy to head down and take care of this Graboid issue, as he is looking for something to do anyways. Alright, so breaking away from the summary real quick, it's time to correct one of my earlier thoughts. I mentioned in the first Tremors video that I made that they were likely cut off during the Ice Age period by the rising mountains, and I mentioned that they probably weren't alive during dinosaur times. So with the introduction of new information comes the introduction of new ideas. That's how science is supposed to work. And I've got something later that I think kind of makes absolute sense as well. So the Tremors are in fact from the Precambrian period based on their fossilized evidence and one of the setae left behind in that layer of rock. So confirmed, Graboids existed before dinosaurs. Alright, so back to the summary. As they meet up at the processing plant, Kate has been working with one of the setae that she did find and discovers that it does date back before the dinosaurs. Seeing as these creatures are that old, this would make them likely the oldest living species still around. As they discuss the implications of this, the entire building begins to shake. Believing it to be one of the return of the Graboids, they lock and load and get ready to go. Although if the building was shaking, wouldn't that mean that they are actually under it? But at any rate, when they all look out, their fears are assuaded by the fact that they discover that Bert is just in a giant truck loaded to the teeth with munitions. Bert then exits the truck to the happiness of Earl and shows them what he's got. He remarks how Earl and Grady could have asked for anything from the Mexican military and all they brought was a case of dynamite. He opens up the back of the truck to reveal that there are enough tools fit for a small army. And for all you new people to the channel, I do have to call them that, otherwise this video gets that yellow symbol and it's really annoying. I know, incredibly lame, but it is what it is. Anyhow, Kate remarks saying that this is ridiculous, they're just worm hunting, but the expressions on everyone's faces kind of convinces her that maybe this is a little more dire than she originally thought when it comes to Graboids. They exchange some of the munitions and then all three head out. Earl and Grady continue to work together as Bert goes off alone to take out as many as he can. Throughout the day, they have some pretty great success with it. Getting into a quasi-competition with one another, Bert quickly closes the gap and actually starts to gain on them. After Bert takes one out, one Graboid in particular ends up moving away from Grady and Earl. Strangely, even though likely, it would appear as though they are in range to be heard. They give chase to the creature, keeping an eye on it on the monitor. Earl suggests that maybe these creatures are learning and says that they might have some sort of plan going on, remarking that they may be actually digging out a trap for them. They round the corner and the Graboid is waiting for them as it lands on the truck. Earl then floors it backwards. They land in a ravine and quickly get on the truck. As they wait for the attack from the Graboid, it then lets out a wail which is new to both of them. Grady then grabs the remote control truck and heads up to see what it's doing. The Graboid is just laying there, making noises and seems to be in distress. They use the truck and try to annoy it to blow it up, but it doesn't move. Grady then slaps it and still, it does not attack them. Grady then realizes that this is the creature that they can bring back alive for $100,000. Earl then calls in Pedro to come out with the crane so that they can carry this thing back. Throughout the night, Bert continues to blow up Graboids, and the live one Earl and Grady caught lets out a shriek. This one sounds different though. They debate on going to check on it, thinking that maybe it's just being eaten, so they kind of decide that they need to protect their investment. They then go check on it to find that the inside of it has been tore clean open. There's no tracks around it or any indication that an animal was eating it, so Earl suggests that something came out of it. This spooks them entirely and they head back to the truck. There they attempt to radio everyone, telling them to, kind of get out, but the radios are down. Hearing shrieks in the distance, they surmise that another Graboid is going through the same issue. As they do this, they see that Pedro's truck has then stopped in the distance and come to a rest. They decide that they will walk over to get a hold of him, and they do so with the monitor and everything that they can carry. As they do, they approach the truck to see that it's completely destroyed. The engine bay has been ripped out and they can't find Pedro. Eventually though, after searching the truck, they see his hands over the back of the railing. They then move around to the back of the truck and find that his arms, in a very Jurassic Park-esque way, are just hanging there by themselves. This spooks Earl, as this is a completely different ballgame from what he is usually seen concerning an attack. They begin to panic, but then head up to the radio tower to signal for help, or at least try to warn everyone not to come around this area. Meanwhile, Bert has also noticed that the radio contact has dropped out. To this, he decides that returning to the base is the best course of action. As he does, he mentions that he hasn't seen any Graboids in hours, despite him tracking one to the area, which he finds very strange. With Earl and Grady at the radio station, they find all the radio equipment has been completely destroyed. It's beginning to look like these creatures are actually starting to understand human tech. Grady mentions how there were no people in the area to eat, so they must be cutting them off purposely. They then find a car and decide to hotwire it out of the area. As they do, they hear a noise around the side of the building. They get into position and then wait for it. As it moves, they assume that it must be huge. They then point their tools over the roof line, waiting for it to move around the corner, to which this creature does. It turns out it's only roughly about 3 feet in height or 1 meter. Looking like a mini Graboid with legs, it then turns and its head opens up. It shrieks and then runs at them. They quickly take it out easily, enemy, with one landed hit after missing quite a few, which ultimately ends the beast. As they inspect this creature, they see that it has legs and no eyes, just like the big ones. They assume it can hear, however, and that's why it must have known that they were there. They quickly jump into the car as they hear another noise and take off as 3 more round the corner. Bert is still continuing his drive back to the base, and as he does, he stops to make sure he's going the right way. When he does, one of the creatures then jumps onto the hood. The next day, Kate attempts to get someone on the radio, but it looks like it's just sort of a lost cause. As she does, Julio appears at the window and then is attacked by an unseen force. Blood splatters the window and the creatures have descended upon the base. Kate backs into a corner and then waits. Luckily, Earl and Grady arrive to take out the creature and then move inside. They grab Kate and attempt to escape, but one of the creatures has then jumped onto the car and destroyed the engine in the process. They move inside and come to the conclusion that there must be only about 24 left. They then see Bert coming over the hill with his truck in tatters but still driving. It's clear he has seen battle and the truck is covered in guts. He remarks that he was denied need-to-know information about these things and is completely out of ammo. He discusses how many he took out, and there's already way more than they thought there were. That said, Bert saw one of them was shocked and detained it with 1,000-pound test line. They then take it inside and close the doors, sort of test on it and figure out what it is and how it operates. While they were testing on it, one, however, was stuck on the underside of the truck. Hurt and hungry, it then finds one of Bert's MREs and begins to eat. As they start their test with a broom on the other side of the door to see how the creature responds, it really doesn't react to movement or sound. It does, however, react when they put their hands up. The creature's head opens up and it shrieks, indicating that it has found food. Bert surmises that it must be seeing an infrared and can sense the heat of their bodies, and that is the opening of its heat sensor. When it screams, the creature gives off a lot of heat as well, which is how it may be able to communicate with the others in its group by signaling with body heat. They figure out that that's why it tore up the cars and radio station, because of the heat that was produced. As the creature drags its tongue across the ground, they realize that it's still tasting with its tongue, much like its worm-like ancestors. When it touches something it likes, it eats it. After eating the MRE, however, the creature appears to be getting sick. It instead then throws up an embryo which falls on the ground. This embryo then hatches and it is a fully living creature as well. So at this point, they realize that the creatures are asexual and are undergoing parthenogenesis and reproduce by food ingestion, which could be a major issue as this is exponential population growth. Kate states that they had taken a completely separate evolutionary path, which can be kind of right, but it's not entirely right. One then bursts through the window as Bert's food has created dozens of these things. The group then runs and hides behind a wall as they continue to look for them in the distance. They use the door that was left over in the construction to move around the side of the building. They then find one of these creatures in their direct path that they need to go to. Bert then takes it out with a shot from the 50 cal. Unfortunately, it destroys the truck behind the creature, which how could he have known? As they run back to the building, they all get separated. The creatures don't seem to be able to climb up and reach them and can't sense their body heat and begin to mill around. In a possible appearance of object permanence, one in particular begins breaking down the door to the building to get to Kate and Earl, to which they send out a steamy jumpsuit to distract them. They then make their run towards the oil towers and get out of reach of the walkers. They realize that this has actually trapped them, but Kate brings up the fact that nobody has heard from them in a while, so surely they'll come looking for them eventually. The issue is, however, these things are related to graboids, which means that they are social predators. They eventually are able to begin stacking up on one another to get on top of the oil towers. As they do this and begin making their way up, Bert uses himself as bait and then takes off running. Bert runs inside a building and then closes the creatures inside. After they celebrate, they come to the realization that they just locked them in there with a ton of food. Realizing they are going to be numbering in the thousands, they have come to the conclusion that they need to detonate the building. They cover Earl with CO2 from a fire extinguisher, which lowers his ambient heat onto the surface. He moves through and the heat seekers can't really detect him as he gets to the truck. As he does though, the CO2 begins quickly failing, and the creatures begin to see his body heat as he sets the timer on the truck. He's able to climb out by a fire hose and informs the group that the whole thing is about to blow. As he does, Bert tells them to just keep running. They get to a ditch, which he assumes that this will be good enough, just as the whole building explodes, taking out the problem entirely. Earl then gets Miss October 1974, which, fun fact, Miss October 1974 was actually a Panamanian, and the one in his house is actually Miss September 1970. Don't ask me how I know that, it's just the way life goes sometimes. But they now get paid for 28 worms, which comes out to $1.4 million, which ensures nobody will really have to work again. The American dream. Alright, so with that wrapped up, let's learn about these creatures and why they evolved the way they did, and why these adaptations would likely have formed, which led to them being the most successful and longest living species in this universe. First things first, let's discuss their life cycles. It would appear as though a graboid is nothing more than the larval stage of its life cycle. Initially, these creatures are laid as eggs, which are under the ground and would appear to be kind of waiting until favorable conditions arise. If you would like to see a further breakdown, specifically on the graboids in particular, I will have that video linked at the end of this this one. However, without getting too deep into the Graboid lore, considering we've covered it, it would appear based on the information obtained in Tremors 2 that asexual reproduction continues to run through this species as its main form of reproduction. When a Graboid appears to eat enough after a certain amount of time, the heat seekers, as they have been called before, will begin to form within this Graboid. This internal gestation is known as viviparous birth, as the heat seekers are born completely functional and ready to go. It's sort of strange that they become oviparous later in their life cycles, which means that the eggs are laid and then hatched. Regardless, this viviparous birth has been compared to a metamorphosis, but that isn't entirely true. Metamorphosis involves the breakdown of the creature itself and then its subsequent reassembly into another creature. This larval stage of the Graboid appears to actually result in the end of the Graboid and the creation of new creatures entirely separate from the original entity, as shown when the remains of the Graboid are burst with the side open. So instead, it's really just kind of pure birth at this point, except it results in the end of the parent. It would appear, however, though, that the Graboid would likely serve more purpose than just creating these creatures. Likely while on the inside of this worm, the heat seekers will then eat their way out. And this is why we see the Graboid appearing in great distress as it sits there not moving. The internal pain is likely great until eventually the creature meets its end. Through this nutritional intake, however, the heat seekers likely would be able to move out and then throw up more of themselves as they reproduce shortly after. This would mean that likely the assumed, how they said there was about 24 of them if 3 were formed per creature left, would not be true, because Bert mentions how many he took out and there are still more. Because of this, they come out completely capable of reproduction though, even if it's with themselves. Getting a good look at these creatures, it's easy to see their Graboid lineage. However, the introduction of legs now means that they can obviously hunt above the ground and stalk prey more effectively. Their short, compact bodies, thick skin, and 3 toes appear to have co-adapted with an era of the dinosaurs in terms of similarities, which would have made them likely capable of chowing down on smaller animals around them. They still possess the same mouth with a single pharynx that comes out much more like the worm progenitors. Again, only 1 though rather than the 3. Interestingly, it does appear though that 3 of these creatures are spawned from the worms, which their mouth also has 3 pharynx. Now, it's probably not likely related, but make of that what you will. So the question is, why develop legs in the first place? Well, again, knowing that these creatures developed in the Precambrian, which predates dinosaurs, this adaptation would have been paramount to their success as a species. Likely in the beginning, these creatures were actually just worms. Derived from some sort of carnivorous worm, they may have not had any other life cycle tacked on, and instead, that would develop later. Likely they still reproduce by parthenogenesis, which actually, isn't as strange as you might think. You may believe that it's mostly just insects that do this, such as ants and stick bugs, but actually, there have been cited cases of snakes reproducing with no males around to kick off the fertilization process. These snakes were all female, however the young, they really aren't too healthy. A lot of the time this resulted in stillborn snake young. The moral of this story is that asexual reproduction is not beyond the grasp of complex animals beyond insects. And considering these creatures appear to predate reptiles and form during the era of giant bugs, these traits likely stem from this point in time. But instead of it being a sort of side trait that just happens to be possible with standard reproduction being preferred for genetic diversity, the Graboid species has mastered the ability to reproduce totally independent of one another. Now, just as a side note, there are massive issues with this. For instance, genetic diversity would be quite impacted. With literally no genetic diversity amongst these creatures, all could really have descended from one parent, and over time, this would lead to vulnerability to a single disease that could, in theory, completely wipe them out due to issues of lack of resistance provided by different genes. Anyways, I could go on about that for like hours, but just know that asexual reproduction is a whole host of issues with genetic diversity, and typically, it can work, but the way forward is variety is the spice of life. Back to the original question of leg development though, it would likely be because as the planet changed, the species they hunted changed. So too must they change. The worms themselves were likely large enough to take down prey such as dinosaurs, and more importantly, as long as they weren't going after apex species such as like Spinosaurus or Tyrannosaurus rex or massive herbivores, likely these worms could eat medium-sized dinosaurs, and for a time, this worked perfectly for them. But this golden era was not to last for the worms. We all have a general idea of what happened to the dinosaurs. It's assumed that it wasn't just the asteroid at this point that hit the Yucatan Peninsula that destroyed them, but a series of hits ranging from volcanic activity, which released sulfur into the air, causing a colder climate, which then caused vegetation to thin out. And after these impacts happened, it just kind of was too much for the ecosystems to recover, so larger dinosaurs met their end. However, a lot of dinosaurs took to the skies, which we see as birds now, or remained in the rivers and lakes, which are just literal crocodiles and alligators. This would indicate the dire need for these creatures to adapt or meet their end. During the multiple hits to the ecosystems that happened over time prior to the extinction of the dinosaurs, this is likely when the adaptations to the environments happen. With smaller dinosaurs and herbivores being mainly on the menu, and larger prey succumbing to the pressures of the changes, this meant that these creatures could no longer stay in their current form to be successful. Not only is food scarcity a limiting factor, which is pretty smart as it limits their population when there's low food and allows them to thrive when there's high food levels, but their own forms were limiting as well. So as prey became smaller or just took to the skies in general, the heat seekers that could walk became the favored model after the impact, as they were more successful at hunting with their social pack and could be sustained by smaller prey. They also could reproduce after a meal when there was clearly food in the area to sustain their population. The issue with this, however, is you get a massive population explosion, which in turn would quickly overwhelm an area's resources and then lead to their own detriment. So with that said, this form of population growth may have also indicated that they were no longer the top predators too. Instead, much like how a wolf is a mid-tier predator and is sometimes eaten by bears, the heat seeker would likely have its own predators to limit it during this specific point in time. But one thing you may be wondering about at this point is the infrared. Well, don't worry, because your boy has the perfect answer to that. As the Graboids evolved, they specifically reacted to the compressional waves within the ground. This is something like a mid-tier dinosaur creating. It was easily found and then caught. They didn't need to develop any form of tracking due to this because this was their main way of hunting. And it's not like the dinosaurs could really rationalize anything being under the ground or even understand it was there. But interestingly, a thought experiment could be done, and this may have actually been what pushed them into the skies in their own form of evolution in this universe. But this is why the Graboids would also have an answer to this when we discuss this in the next episode. But concerning the heat seekers, isn't it interesting that they started seeking heat in their smaller form? I mean, if you really think about it, the Graboids adapted to beasts above them walking around, and that's all they needed to do. After the disappearance of their cold-blooded dinosaurs, you know what else would kind of start popping up? Mammals. Mammals are warm-blooded and produce their own body heat, and our earliest ancestors lived under the ground in burrows to boot. Likely, the Graboids would come across this new form of animal with its warm body heat that was under the ground. As pressures were put on them to adapt, this interaction with the small food may have caused new traits to develop within the Graboids. And this is all because they became aware of the creatures producing its own heat. Dinosaurs, again, are what's known as cold-blooded animals. This means that they are reliant upon the heat of their environment to run their metabolism. It's really not a bad way of doing things on a warm planet, but an issue begins to arrive when climate changes. This can heavily impact them and make them sluggish or prone to overheating as their bodies are pushed to more extremes of their operating temperatures. A mammal, however, produces its own heat and remains a constant unless exposure is to happen. This heat production would turn out to be something that they became hunted by. With the Graboids' large food source gone or dwindling, mammals became the main prey for a time. Adapting to drop the sense of sound as a method of hunting, the organ on top of their head could sense heat and opens up when warm-blooded prey is around. If you think that's strange, actually rattlesnakes do the same thing and strike at prey that is putting off body heat. They can sense it. But the heat seekers will also communicate by releasing their own body heat, which is how they can actually talk to the rest of their group. The reason for the small stature, as noted by Grady and Earl when they see one, is because at the beginning, mammals were very small, likely the size of rodents. After the destruction of the dinosaurs, mammals then began to diversify and fill niches, and ultimately could become larger and may have actually hunted heat seekers in turn. But for their creation to happen, their food source was small, and so they shrunk in size. On top of body mass decrease, this walking gave the Graboid species a better chance at long-term survival. It would appear that the Graboids, specifically in Perfection Valley, were trapped by rock on 3 sides and a cliff on the 4th. Because of this, they went into hibernation for quite some time. And even with the introduction of human food, it still wasn't enough to warrant a change into the heat seekers in the events of the first movie. That said, with the alluvial hills of Mexico, we see more Graboids, and as a result, there must be more food in the area. And considering that it is sort of like a green pasture as opposed to a desert, this is unsurprising. But this allows for the creation of the heat seekers, which in turn allows for their survivability, if not for humans, to be increased as well. Being able to walk is a huge deal for these things. They can traverse rock and move into areas that would otherwise have been cut off to them. They can also hunt in these mountains, where there may be even more prey, adding to their ability to survive. These creatures are not really that smart, however, and actually appear to be less intelligent than their original larval stage. Whereas the worms would study a structure and set traps, the walkers are not seen doing any of that. Instead, they appear to be more food-driven and animalistic and less concerned about planning. This mental degradation also likely stems from food shortages that they found themselves in, which would be a pretty good indicator of the rise of the heat seekers. The summation of these creatures is that when the dinosaurs were on their way out and mammals were on the rise, the Graboids were forced to adapt to a new environment stressor after hundreds of millions of years of large prey at their disposal. This resulted in an astronomical change structurally and intellectually to the body, making them hunt by heat rather than by the vibrations, considering there were no large cold-blooded animals around in great capacity that they are used to. This median stage of life form would go on later to become the ass blasters that we see in Tremors 3, but we will discuss that later.